So again, for those people that have just joined, if you can, as we go, drop any questions in the chat function. We'll come back to those as part of the panel questions at the end, so please drop the questions in. It's always great to get some interaction back from those attending and viewing the event. So please do drop them in. We do have some questions to ask the panel, so please don't worry too much if you don't have any, but participate if you can. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll kick off, and just to make sure that everybody knows that what the event's about, and that you're on the right event today. I know we're all bouncing from Teams meeting to Zoom meeting, and trying to remind ourselves of where we are today. But you're at an event that's called AI Friend or Foe. In short, AI is increasingly more common, as you know, in every life as a piece of language that it gets thrown around and maybe is a little bit misunderstood. And this discussion today is to help us maybe unlock a little bit of that and challenge perhaps thinking and ideas around the applications of AI. Companies are increasingly turning to AI and using AI to help them understand their customers, or how they plan for the future, or how they innovate. It is making the world a better place. Probably we hear the bad stories as opposed to the good stories more often than not, so it'd be really good to hear some of those positive applications today. But I think there's also a lot of rhetoric around, you know, is AI going to replace humans? Is this about computers taking over? And I think I'm sick, probably as many of you are, of seeing pictures of Terminator associated with AI. There's not much of a useful image for the AI landscape, and I think today is challenging a little bit that thinking. So we're delighted to be joined by Dennis and Nick. I'm afraid I'm looking off the screen just to make sure I've got my notes, so forgive me as I look away. I'm going to read out what I've got here. So Dennis is the Relationship Officer at Nexus, the University of Leeds Innovation Hub, with a strong background in philosophy, ethics, and society of science. Let me get this right. Society in science and technology. Dennis specialises in dealing with questions on data and research methodology. I don't think I sold you well enough there, Dennis, but I'm probably stumbling over my words. I will let you introduce yourself in a second. But secondly, on to Nick, who is on top right on my screen, but I'm never sure if it shows the same way for everyone else. Nick is Associate Professor of Data Analytics for Population Research at the University of Leeds. He is a Fellow of Alan Turing Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence, and is co-director of Economic and Social Research Council, funded by the Consumer Data Research Centre. I think I got that out, Nick, just about. But thank you very much for joining us. And lastly, but by no means least, my colleague and co-founder, Ken Miller, who is our Chief Technical Officer here at Panintelligence. He is our AI BI guru and at the heart of the innovation and product that we've developed here at Panintelligence. I'm Sandra Moore. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Panintelligence with Ken, and I'll tell you a little bit about us, and then I'll ask for Dennis, Nick, and then Ken to just sort of say a little bit more about their roles and the things that they're passionate about. Would be great, the things that they really interest them in this area, and then we'll get on to some questions. So Panintelligence, we're a data analytics software business here based in Leeds, hence why we've got two wonderful colleagues from Leeds with us on the call. We are obsessive, passionate about democratizing and enabling everybody to be able to get the best value out of data to make real change and affect real change. By enabling everyone to be able to build insights from data, the people that understand the problem can be empowered to actually make decisions quickly and effectively to make change happen. So what we do is we have a tool, a piece of technology which allows non-technical people to build retrospective insights over data, so things like reports, real-time insights over data like data visualizations or dashboards. You may are familiar with those, but also build machine learning models. Machine learning is a complex phrase for something that actually is very simple. All of us remember doing statistics at school, or some basic mathematics. Probability is probably the simplest way, but essentially a lot can be determined by doing some very simple mathematical models over data to determine the likelihood of something happening based on a lot of data. And Panintelligence also has the ability to take us back to school without having to remember the maths, to build very simple models, to be able to predict outcomes and help us to inform decisions by understanding patterns and trends in a very simple way. So yeah, Panintelligence really is at the heart of this kind of enabling people to be able to unlock the value from data, and our sort of machine learning engine and that kind of AI journey that we are moving towards. Whilst that is something that we are capable of, it's very, very normal for Panintelligence to find the majority of our people are still wrestling with the basics, you know, what's happening today and what happened yesterday. And we're still solving that problem, never mind the problem of looking into the future. So that's us at Panintelligence. So I'm going to move on to my my colleagues who've joined us on the call. So Dennis, it'd be really good to hear from you briefly on your sort of your current role and the things that you've sort of engaged in, if that's okay.
Yeah, very happy. And thank you for the lovely introduction. Something to live up to now. I'm Dennis Dokter. I'm a relationship officer at Nexus, and one of my main duties there is to help connect members of the Nexus community to connect with academics at the university. So basically build that bridge between, on the one hand, potential research interests from companies or an R&I interest from companies, and see how we can match them with the right academic expertise. That's one part of the job. The other one is I'm also there data lead, and I help them with their research methodology. So basically, when we're looking at companies that are very heavily involved with data intelligence or with AI, I try to help them, give them advice on what are the knowledge gaps, what are potential opportunities, and how can we make sure that we get them filled, and how can we use the wider RIS team to find these connections within the university and have the right academics match up with you, and maybe also help you find a better place within the wider Leeds ecosystem. My personal background also, as you mentioned, indeed, in specializing in philosophy and ethics of science and technology. I used to be a lecturer on data ethics and the role of research in society, where I try to help the Dutch ministries understand how the role of research can change, but also how the role of data is important, and how this can be perceived and can be utilized in order to solve, or well, at least aim to solve, societal challenges, but also how to look at technological adoption from a completely different perspective. In a nutshell, I guess.
Thanks, Dennis. That's brilliant. And I'm sure when we get onto the subject of sort of ethics around AI, it will be a good area for us to dig into in a bit more detail. So, Nick, I'm over to you just a little bit more about sort of what you're working on at the moment and your background.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for the invite. So, yeah, my name's Nick Lomax, academic based at the University of Leeds. So I have several roles at Leeds and more widely. So I'm an associate professor based in the School of Geography, so I'm very interested in spatial data and understanding spatial patterns and relationships. I sit within an institute that we have at Leeds called the Leeds Institute for Data Analytics, so LEADA. LEADA are very focused on kind of making the most of data. We have really good infrastructures for handling secure data and making it available to researchers for research purposes. Strong remit on training and development of skills, which I hope we'll touch on a little bit later as well. I'm also the co-director of the Consumer Data Research Centre, which is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. And what we do in the CDRC is we effectively bridge the gap between commercial organizations and academics. So we get commercial data and do interesting things with it, for want of a better description. So we're very interested in taking data that's not usually used for providing insight into kind of societal problems and doing, you know, useful things. So if you wanted to look at the CDRC website, you'll see there's a whole host of case studies related to the use of those data. Some of that is AI, some of that is not AI. The boundaries do get blurred, I think, but we do things like understanding health and consumption based on loyalty card data. We build lots of classifications of things, so looking at vulnerability and consumer vulnerability using classifiers. Classifications of different types of schools. So you name it, if it's to do with kind of people and interactions with daily lives, we're interested in it. And then the other role that I have is as a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. So the ATI is the National Institute for AI and Data Science. So the remit of the Turing Institute is very broad, everything from kind of innovation in AI and machine learning right the way through to understanding ethics. So I have a a role within the institute as well, very focused on kind of urban analytics, understanding how people interact with urban areas, and I'm very interested in the current digital twin agenda, so building digital representations of physical or social infrastructures so that you can start to look at potential future outcomes. So very broad, but a great deal of interest in kind of AI and data more generally, really.
Yeah, I love that sort of urban analytics. I know Slingshot Simulations, who's another kind of local business that we've had, a number of interactions with, and the work they're doing on digital twins and the segue between kind of that 3D imaging and modelling and data, and the power of that combination around, being able to show prediction in some visual models, I think is incredibly powerful. So some amazing kind of developments, technology, where technology and data science are coming together right now, which I think are really fascinating. So maybe we'll touch on that. Ken, over to you, really, just a little bit of kind of your passions, and I know what you spend your day job doing. But
yeah, I'll start off with a slight statistical joke, which you can see there's a great deal of correlation between wearing red and working for Panintelligence today. If anyone else likes a little bit of stats like I do, but I would say there's not necessarily a causation effect, but given that I'm wearing a Panintelligence red top, maybe there's causation in it as well. But we'll leave that for the discussion as we go through. As Andrew says, I was one of the co-founders of Panintelligence. Pre-Panintelligence, we worked in the software industry in the financial sector. So we had a great deal of experience of building scorecards, underwriting, debt recovery scorecards, all of those sorts of things. And actually, that's what fed through into the Panintelligence journey that we've been on. As Andrew said at the beginning, we're passionate about data. We know the expense and the time people put in collecting data, making sure that data is clean and can allow decisions to be made upon it. And really, we'd like to see businesses become more and more data driven. So making those decisions using data to provide the basis of those decisions. And as much as the AI and the ML piece is very important to us, actually the core of what we do usually is just in terms of people being able to visualize and understand the data that they hold. So that is a quick intro to me.
Good, and obviously we didn't have the wardrobe chat before the call today, but it's good to see that we're living our correlated values, which I know is a passion for this subject. And I think today, really getting into that kind of first question, which was posed at the start of this, which is AI friend or foe? And I know you guys have had some conversations out before this event, so I'm sort of keen, Ken, because I think you've had some of that kind of you've thrown some of that around candidly as to how you'd like to lead on that first question. Where would you like us to start?
Yeah, I mean, I've got very strong opinions on this, and I think as Dennis and Nick and I, we had a little bit of a catch up, which was supposed to last about 10-15 minutes, and we were 45 minutes into a very long discussion about this when we realised perhaps we ought to keep some of this for today as much as we were enjoying it yesterday. So I think it would be great to kick off with Dennis if you want to take the subject, and for me, AI friend or foe.
No, very, very happy to start. I think what when we discussed yesterday, I'd always say, and I think we kind of agreed on it, but seeing AI as a tool, and in that sense, we use it for something. And I have a very much a constructivist point of view, so I am very much convinced that we influence technology in the way we aim it to be, but then again, the creative technology influences us. And in that sense, I strongly believe that we are inherently connected to technology. I mean, if we didn't have technology, we'd all be sitting in the dirt right now, not being able to have this webinar virtually. And in that sense, I think it really connects us, and our relationship is to looking how do we design technology is really much dependent on our intentions and our imagination. So in a sense, I think AI, yes, can be a friend, yes, can be a foe. It's very much dependent on who's on the receiving end or on the using end of the technology. so it can be good and bad. So thinking about design and implementation, a good example I think is always dynamite, and of course Nobel, and when he developed it, not having the intention to actually weaponize it, but to use it for good. And in shame, as the story goes, whether it's really true I do not know, but saying that's why he created the Nobel Prize, in order to show that technology should always be used in order to create a good change in the world and never be ill-used. However, I think with dynamite, it's a bit more easy to see that how you use it can give already that intention. And can it be used for good, can it be used for bad? Also depending on, for instance, using in the mining industry, and whether you're pro or con mines can have an influence. And the same, and I think it's a bit easier for guns, for instance, what the design and intention is. And translating that to AI, I mean, looking at science fiction, there's a lot of different different visualizations. You have, for instance, the Terminator series, but that is one way, of course, of how that technology has been designed, because I think that's something that we always need to take in mind. It is always designed by humans, so it will not do anything that humans did not intend it to do, maybe not consciously, but in that sense, it's always coded, and somebody has to write the code. It doesn't fall out of the sky and write itself. And in that sense, I think, I don't know if everybody has read the article about, I think, gig worker economy and, for instance, planning systems used by for instance, Amazon, in terms of when workers show up in order to do the work or not. And of course, looking from it from a certain business perspective, it can be seen as something very good, a very good implementation of AI. However, I think that for the people that express worries because they don't know whether they'll be working the next day or not, I don't think that's being received as very good. So it's a very, very big discrepancy in how you use it. And it's the same, for instance, in health. And I think that's, and I have a very strong opinion on AI. For me, it is just an automation of a human process. Very complicated, though, in the sense that it's able to do something that we're not able to do, that therefore we designed it to do that. I recently made the analogy towards, for instance, a forklift. We're not able to lift that such heavy weights, so we invented something to do that for us. And it's the same with AI. We're not able, for instance, to go through thousands of MRI pictures in a matter of seconds. However, via the use of AI, we are able to do that, and that opens up new ways in order for us to improve healthcare, for instance. And I think that will develop further, and as much as we allow it to develop, that's how it develops. It's very much, if you look at the development of technology, it's not like a progressive line. It's very symmetrical. It can go the one way, it can go very much one way, it can go very much the other way. If you look at the development, for instance, of the iPad and how popular it became, tablets were used before that time already, but they never really got off the ground in terms of adoption. And same for smartphones, for instance, or for all sorts of things. And I think there's this in social construction of technology, we call that the stabilization phase. As technology develops, there are certain problems that exist around a technology or not, or certain, I think you'd have to call it perceptions, and they call it interpretive flexibility. So everybody has a different opinion, and when there's kind of a majority behind the idea, it'll softly start to land in society and stabilize until something else comes along again and either breaks it up or stabilizes it even further. And I think things you always need to take into account for that is also non-users. So why aren't people using a certain technology? I remember when Google Glass came out, oh, well, actually never really came out, but when they were trialing it, it was very positively received at first. And then they said, we're mentioning how you could take videos and pictures without anybody noticing, and suddenly privacy became a very big issue surrounding it. And we haven't heard anything from it, really, from mainstream media, at least, from it since. And that kind of shows how we ourselves kind of depend and decide on what it is and how it's used to. So I hope that gives a little bit of an idea about how I feel about
yes, there's a real sense of that, Dennis, that that there is we're not at stability point, and the market is still deciding whether it's friend or foe, right? And that is governing perhaps adoption, and therefore influencing perhaps where parts of the market or economy are adopting this technology based on whether they perceive it to be a friend or foe, maybe, and that understanding why people think it's a foe or what's stopping people from adopting it, maybe part of the question here, maybe. I don't know, Ken, should we ask Nick perhaps on your view on this?
I'm going to try and let the guys go a little first because I'll get very carried away because it's so exciting.
Yeah, just your thoughts, Nick, on this.
Yeah, thanks. Well, you know, what you say about markets still deciding is interesting, but uptake and adoption of AI is massive. I think it's the first thing to say is that AI is here and it's here to stay. So it's been a bit of a stop-start story for AI, but the algorithms that underpin what we call AI have been around for quite a long time. But what we now have, and we have much more of in the last 10 years, is huge proliferation of data. These are really data-hungry algorithms. And we've got huge training data sets now that we just didn't have before. And part of that is because of greatly increased compute power. So the ability to store these data and also the ability to run algorithms over them mean that AI is now established and it's accelerating. You know, in the UK, we've now got a government office for AI. They're being advised by an independent council for AI, and the roadmap was released last month. And we're kind of looking at having a national AI strategy fairly soon. So the technology and the principles are being established and formalized very, very quickly. So it is definitely here to stay. I touched briefly in my introduction on the Turing Institute, but the fact that we have a nationally funded Institute for AI and Data Science suggests that, you know, the investment is going in the right direction. So not just in building algorithms for business, but also in providing the infrastructure for training and understanding how they work in the first place. And it's not just us, you know, Germany, France, the USA have all very recently announced billion-dollar investments in AI infrastructures. So I think my primary view is that we'd be foolish to dismiss AI because it is here. And I think we'd be foolish not to embrace it positively given that all this is happening. Now, that's not to say that there aren't things in there that could turn it into a foe, but we can probably mitigate quite a lot of those threats as we go through, really. So my basic view is that it's all very exciting, and we should be embracing it where we can. And I can carry on and go through some of the sort of the headlines that I've been thinking about. Shall I do that and then interject?
Why not? I think this is a conversation, so share it and then we can use that as part of the conversation, Nick.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I was thinking about was whether it's a friend or a foe in terms of innovation. And I think, you know, AI does drive innovation. The applications are wide, so you've got the really mundane, you know, it filters your spam emails into your spam box. And then it goes all the way up to the really exciting, so self-driving cars and you know, visual classifiers for understanding cancer screening and that kind of thing. But ultimately, it is just a set of tools, you know. So AI, in the context of how we're using it at the moment, is a toolbox. So the kind of the flip side to that innovation is that those tools can be implemented very well, or they can be implemented really badly, and it almost turns into a foe when the tools are used wrongly. So there are a lot of people potentially who are trying to implement AI, machine learning, neural nets, whatever you want to call them, in bad ways. So, you know, without a reasonable underpinning in statistics, you might ask the wrong questions and apply the algorithms in the wrong way. And I think that does cause real problems. And then even where people do know what they're doing, they end up implementing them badly too quickly. So, you know, we've all had experiences of dealing with chatbots for trying to get through to the utilities providers or on the phone. You know, they can be incredibly frustrating, and they're just bad implementations of AI, really. And then, you know, the extension of that is that they can be implemented by people who do know what they're doing, but for the wrong reasons. So the government at the moment has got a call out for evidence on the use of AI in reducing competition and harm for consumers. So, you know, around using algorithms for price fixing, discrimination, posting fake reviews onto websites, that kind of thing. So there is a real problem there, whereby without the right regulation and infrastructure to regulate these things, it can turn into a foe, because it can be used for whatever the person wants to use it for. So it's back to the tools idea. And they can be very black box as well. So quite often you hear about AI and people think that it's an incredibly complicated black box of stuff that only experts are able to implement, but actually you can implement AI in a very transparent way. You know, all good science should really be reproducible, and it's not any different with AI and the algorithms that underpin it. You know, and you know, using these things properly is good. I saw a talk a couple of years ago, which was really interestingly framed. It was somebody trying to classify areas of different cities that looked like Paris. So they were trying to find little Paris in other cities around the world. And what they ended up with was a whole load of industrial estates, because their classifier had picked up that Paris was full of vans. And then they'd identified these areas that were kind of industrial, light industrial, because the vans were the key visual that were being picked up by the classifier. So even if you set out with the right intentions, you can end up with something that comes out the other end that just doesn't make very much sense.
Nick, they're great. I mean, I don't know if there's any more points there, but just to sort of summarise what I think you've said, because I think there's an awful lot in that that's brilliant. You know, so I think it feels like there's a tipping point we're at. You know, infrastructure and volumes of data are now enabling us to use technology and algorithms with the right skills. To your point, you know, the good and the bad can be, you know, the right intentions but the wrong application. But the fact that we now have all of this data and we have the infrastructure to do this in a way that is fast, and the tools that can give more people capability, that then we're almost at a tipping point of enabling a wider ecosystem to engage in this. But the points you made around sort of regulation, in order to make sure that we keep it friend and not foe, that we've got some kind of accountability for the usage of these sort of technologies and tools, and that there's a real thinking about implementation. You know, I think you made a really good point there. You know, what is a good implementation with all the right intentions? What do we need to be considering to make sure that what we're building actually is driving the right outcomes, or is not driving the wrong outcomes? And I think there's something in that is probably part of the fear around the foe piece, right? Or maybe drive some of the fear on the foe. Does that feel like some of this was summary of some of the points that you said? I'm just wanting to make sure. Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to highlight before we move on to Ken?
Well, yeah, plenty I'd like to talk about, but I won't. But one thing that probably is worth saying is that the kind of the Skynet version of AI, so you know, the Terminator, is potentially the futurist's view of what might happen. So at the moment we're in a position where AI is used for quite specific things, so quite often termed narrow or weak AI. So it's trained by human to do very specific things that are useful. Where it starts to become a little bit scary is when it becomes a generalist. So you know, the AI becomes often referred to as kind of super intelligent or general intelligent, when it starts to become smarter than the humans that built it. And this is a, you know, Elon Musk, Bill Gates and others have started to point at the future and how it might turn into something a little bit more scary. But you know, that's trying to predict something that isn't here yet. So I think at the moment we are very much dealing with tools that do specific things. And I suppose that might be something we want to pick up on a bit later, but I thought I'd frame it now because there is a bit of a distinction in my mind between the two things.
Yeah, and I think there's a huge chasm between the two things at the moment. And when I think about where we as a business find ourselves, invariably, irrespective of the capability of our tooling, we're still at the very basic conversations of just tell me what happened yesterday, please. I can't look into the future yet because I don't know what happened yesterday. So, you know, I think these discussions are really good to understand where we are on this journey. But for the majority, I think we're still at a very kind of base camp, quite frankly, when it comes to data insight. Ken, that probably brings me on to sort of you and thinking about that. I'm really interested in that kind of friction between, you know, that kind of, do we need the skills and the understanding to make sure that the kind of intention doesn't lead to a bad outcome, you know, but to Dennis's kind of dynamite analogy, you know, and where do you see this from? You really, I know you're passionate about it, kind of domain experts and enabling them in this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes to the heart of the friend or foe argument for me, really, which is the fact that quite often AI, and I think, Dennis, you made this point when we were chatting yesterday, this would be so much better down the pub as well, by the way. I'm just sitting here thinking, if we were in the pub, none of us would be leaving tonight. We'd be talking about this all night. But essentially, the fact that one piece of AI or one solution, one algorithm could be a friend to some and a foe to others. It depends on your perspective and actually what that's trying to do. But I think there are some things that you can do to mitigate that. And the domain expert is very important in that. And again, Nick, you're talking about the sort of black box side of things. And for us, there's a really big couple of words that I think are really important in people's adoption of AI and acceptance of AI as well. And that's because as humans, we come to accept a level of fairness. And also, to accept that level of fairness, we also have to have the ability to trust what's going on. And to be able to trust something and to see it as a fair process, we need to understand which decisions are being made, who's making those decisions, and on what basis those decisions are being made. And that comes to the very heart of this friend versus foe side of things. And I'll actually say, you know, it is a tool. And my favorite phrase of everything is about all models being wrong. And it's about who can identify where those models are applicable, when they're applicable, and when to use them or not. And we got a very famous example that we do. And if anyone's never seen my video, the videos are up there, which is we build a model around whether mushrooms are poisonous or not. And sorry, Xandra, I know I've used this so many times. But going through the model, we'll pose the question constantly, would you eat the mushroom? And that's always the same sort of thing. Would you swallow the decision? Is the decision good enough? And where could it be applied? And really, you're absolutely right. This is about automation. And automation will help with two things. One, reducing either manual disliked tasks or tasks which take a long time or take a lot of people and a lot of resources. Just as every industrial revolution effectively has done, it's about, you know, reducing the human's impact on systems. Or in particular around AI, being able to bring things in where people are prone to error. So again, you can think about any of these sorts of things, sort of classifying images, where there's lots of images and you need to go through and scan those and predict which potentially have you know, cancer and which don't, you know, very important decisions from that point of view, all the way to those autonomous driving. And that then, from an ethics, can pose some slightly different questions. So some of the questions that, or one of my favorite answers that people will give you when they talk about autonomous driving, and hands up, I'm a massive fan of autonomous driving. I'm waiting for the car just to drive me everywhere. Is the fact that they will say, but I like driving. It's something I like doing. And actually that's where the decision has to be taken away from people, because to be quite frank, I like getting home without being involved in a motor accident. So actually we have to start to look at some of these things in a slightly different way. And for me, really, there are some really key tests that we should apply to things. You know, are models helpful? Can they be trusted? Can they be explainable? Are they repeatable? And some of these things that you set would set a very high bar for non-AI decisions as well, where there's a human directly involved in those decisions. And also, is it an appropriate use of AI? So one thing that the press, and I'm sure it's not just the British press, are particularly good at, are pointing out some really, really bad examples of where AI or things described as being AI have run amok or not really added much value. And, you know, we've all seen those things where they've replaced someone flipping burgers with a robot that the cameras stayed around just long enough to see it flip a burger onto the floor and go, you know, okay, and sort of belittling that sort of AI or making it misunderstanding, and it hasn't helped at all. But where I think we are really, really passionate is about making this AI human-centric and making it observable. Because by doing that, you actually start to build that trust and start to build that fairness about things. So any AI process, it's there to assist humans. So there should be an observer. There should be someone watching that, using either sampling, understanding what's going on, making sure that it's actually testing data that it was designed to test. You know, have we got the same sort of population coming through? now that it's making predictions on, that we actually even built the model on. All of those sorts of things are really important to build in there. But at its heart, it is fairness and trust. And I'm going to make the case for millennials now, because we're very good at putting young people down in work. But actually, I think one of the ways that we do drive ethics within AI is actually looking at young people joining the workforce. And I've seen a real shift in the way that people have joined our business and other businesses as well, in that they actually want to work towards something which does provide value, does benefit society, as well as just being a job. And I actually think that attitude will help shape the future of AI and machine learning and how it's applied. And we see that in our business, and we see it in other businesses. So that's kind of my thoughts based on sort of Dennis and Nick, your sort of intros there. That's kind of where I come from.
Thanks, Ken. And I'm not going to paraphrase what you've just said, because I think you've articulated that clearly. And I'm conscious that we've got some more questions to cover, if that's all right. And the next area was about whether or not you're happy with the decisions that are made for you. I'm sure there's lots of applications of AI that you mentioned before. I can't remember if it was Dennis or Nick actually. That was I think it might have been Nick, but tell me if I've got it wrong. But this is the idea that email automation right the way through to cancer treatments and looking at AI in the use of healthcare interventions, or some basic just day-to-day kind of workflows, whether the chatbots are working or not. Are we happy about the decisions that are being made for us? And I think I don't know who wants to start on that, but it'd be really good to get someone to jump in and take the floor. That's all right.
I don't mind having a go, Sandra. So yeah, I spoke briefly about the kind of broad application areas, and just to build on what Ken was talking about with the humans in the loop. So you've got the kind of in the loop system, and then a human outside the loop. So you've got the human working with the algorithm to make sure it's doing the right thing sensibly, and then you've got algorithms that just do what they like. And I'm much more comfortable with the human in the loop at some point, because that's where you get the real value from the AI providing something. So, in the case of cancer screening, for example, there's been a lot of work and academic literature has been written on this, but those algorithms fundamentally need to be trained really well to spot certain types of cancers. So they are able to sort through huge volumes of images in a way that a human never could. But actually, it's working with the oncologist, who then can review, look at the results. Maybe the algorithm has found something that they wouldn't have spotted because of the volume of data, and that's where I'm very comfortable with these AI being part of the decision-making process. An example of some of the work that we've been doing, which I spoke to Dennis and Ken very briefly about yesterday, is some work on kind of trying to appraise the housing market and the rental market in the UK. So we ran a whole load of machine learning algorithms over house price data, and we found that the fit of those models was really good. So the R squared against the observed data was great, but the errors were high. So some of those outliers were much better identified by a human, or at least something which was mimicking the way that humans behave. So I think as soon as you start removing the human entirely, there is it starts to get a little bit more difficult. And that doesn't mean that you don't want an algorithm choosing your playlists, because the risks there are actually quite low. But where things are high risk, I think having a human there is probably a good thing.
Yeah, so that risk point, I think, is at the real heart of this, isn't it? Are you happy about the decisions being made for you? Well, if it's low risk, you're probably not too concerned about. If it feels high risk, then absolutely you want to know how that decision is being made, and ideally you'd like to have some confidence and some trust that there is some ethics or human intervention into that to make sure that there is somebody kind of overseeing that model isn't running out in the wrong direction, right? So risk is absolutely at the heart of and therefore sort of segues into trust, really. How do we trust these models if we perceive that the risk is high? Okay, great. Dennis, I just wondered what you thought about sort of being happy about the decisions that are sort of being made. Where do we sit with that?
Yeah, no, I like the remark about trust from Nick, because I think that always reminds me of normal accident theory from Parrow, where he says the more complex a system is, the more normal it is for accidents to happen. And I think that's the same when you look at whether you're applying AI somewhere. And I think, and it was already highlighted by Nick and Ken, we use it kind of now at the moment as an umbrella term, right? AI or machine learning. And I think that's already something that might give the wrong connotation sometimes, because as we said, it can be something very simple. I mean, even a calculator in that sense can already makes use of some form of AI. And everybody uses day to day. So it's a matter of, I think, progression. And as Nick said, and I do agree with it, AI is here to stay, but how it'll develop is just dependent on how we kind of create it. And in terms of decision making, I think it's much, and there was a nice article in Forbes about the difference between decisions and choices. So making a decision is much more focused on causes, or more like a decision-based model. So it's if then what kind of modeling, while a choice is much more related to reasons. So I think when I first spoke to you, the example of a refrigerator telling me that I'm out of milk, or a refrigerator already ordering milk for me, because it might be that the reason I'm out of milk is was a conscious choice or not, or maybe I don't have the money to spend on milk at the moment, so that's why I did not buy it, and here it goes, spending my budget, because it's it has a bigger implication to make that choice for me. While for other things, just telling me that I'm out of milk, of course, is something I'm at the moment very comfortable with. And I think it's the same in medical diagnosis, giving an advice on what the algorithm has learned from your images compared to thousands of other images, and then laying this in front of a doctor or a team of doctors who then make the choice, is still something that we're more comfortable with than having, for instance, the choice already being made, the choice of treatment already being made by, for instance, an algorithm. And I believe this will change over time, and it is something that will change through generations as well. I recently saw on Facebook the advertise for seatbelts for the new Volvo car, and it's years ago when they introduced 3-point seatbelts. And the negative comments that came in, like, I don't want to be strangled by these sorts of safety implementations. And it's really interesting, because this kind of shows also that stabilization effect. That the more we get used to it, the more we get comfortable with it, and the more things are taken away, or we're working with it and it develops itself, the more we are getting more comfortable with making the decisions for us. Because I think that by using it and not seeing it as a singular thing, like an umbrella, like this AI is this, but knowing there's all these different types of applications that can be used, and very keen to talk about super intelligence later as well, because I have a very, very strong idea about that. But it is about where do you feel, I think it's where people feel comfortable. Some people will already be comfortable with the refrigerator ordering milk for them, for instance. And it's about, I think, giving people the choice for themselves to decide what they are comfortable with. That will help a lot with adoption. And it's about having people themselves interact with it, teaching people, and I'm sure Nick will mention it later, but what, for instance, LEADER is doing in terms of also getting people the right skills into understanding what you're working with. And we had this discussion during the National Data Strategy panel, having people learn these skills and understand what data does and what the applications of AI can already have a big impact on how it develops forwards into the future.
I love that, Dennis. I love the decisions and choice comment. I love your seatbelt analogy. That kind of taking away somebody's choice, and now it's just a given. We all plug the seatbelt in and don't think about it, right? It's so I think the humanized, the human intervention. I think in the loop human, kind of giving them the choice. My husband became vegan. The reason we don't have milk in the fridge is because he made a choice to become vegan. And if you don't have the data endpoints that say what is the data we're missing here that might inform the model. Well, the fact that there's been a choice here that the model isn't aware of, it really influences that kind of ability for the model to make accurate decisions. So that human in the loop helps us to check that there isn't any data missing from the model that may inform it better, right? And that's the fact that we're constantly collecting more data all of the time, and therefore there's probably other data endpoints that we should be considering that are now coming online that could be included, and therefore that consideration that the model doesn't know what it hasn't got, if that makes sense, almost feels like, you know, part of why we need the human in the loop to make sure that it is considering perhaps information that may influence, you know, the choices that are being made. But yeah, I love the fact that it's about giving people the choice as opposed to it just deciding automatically. Ken, I'm conscious of time, and I wonder if we come on to the third question and maybe to address that to you, which is, where would you draw the line?
Yeah, so those people who know me will know that I struggle with drawing the line sometimes. So just over my shoulder here, there's a little robot. It's got a camera on it. It uses OpenCV for image recognition. I programmed it to walk around the office, recognizing people and working out who was in the office at any particular point in time. It lasted a couple of days until HR asked me to take it home. So sometimes I myself have been pretty poor at drawing that line. I think, again, you know, for me, it comes back to the human in this. And just on the previous point, really briefly as well, you know, there are times when people just don't like decisions. So I like every decision when people agree with me. And it's a bit like the seatbelt analogy. I'm old enough to know my parents' generation, and there's still some of them who still clip the seatbelt round the back of their chair to stop the car chirping at them as they drive, because they'll never accept that as a decision. They never ever will. And the analogy I give a little bit, and I think it's about this drawing line sort of thing, is if you have Cyclops in tennis, which is making line call decisions, versus VAR as it was used in football, it's that involvement and allowing people to understand how and when decisions are being made. And to some extent, the VAR has been a bit of a failed experiment. It's not wildly loved. It's here to stay. But in fairness, that's because if you look at the way that most football fans have watched football, they've wanted to berate the referee for the past 50 years anyway. So, you know, they're quite happy not liking the decisions, and they've kind of just morphed that from the referee to the VAR, and they're quite happy being pretty grumpy about things like that. And I say that as a Middlesbrough fan who's pretty grumpy all the time about football. So, you know, those are the sorts of things. I think for me, where we actually draw the line in terms of the AI side of things, it comes back to those central tenets of, is it useful? Is the application good? And do people think it's moral? Do I think we'll continue to draw the line in the right place? Absolutely not. I think that line will be continuously drawn and redrawn. And it will be, you know, this technology, like all technology, like dynamite, going back to that initial example, will be used for things that actually are a bit distasteful, are the sorts of things that we probably don't want them to be used for. But there's also plenty of human activity at the moment that's a bit distasteful and acts in a way that we don't particularly like at the moment, you know, without going down the full sort of war analogies and things like that, and explaining to you all that I'm a Quaker and why I'm a Quaker and all those sorts of things. I won't even go into that. But I think it is something that we'll absolutely struggle with. And Nick, this is where legislation is absolutely required. But I do think that actually inside, outside, and around legislation, it's about people being involved, drawing the lines, whistleblowing, calling up, deciding not to participate in things that they think are morally corrupt. And I do genuinely believe that I see an awful lot of possibilities in that when I look at people joining the business sector at the moment. I think, you know, people do want more than just a job these days, and I think that's a really, really special thing that we should nurture in everybody. So do I think we'll get it right? Absolutely not. I think there's going to be some really, really terrible uses of AI and ML as it goes forward. Do I think it will be Cybernet? Not quite yet, Nick. I actually think we've got bigger problems than that as a human race. I think decarbonisation will get us way before Cybernet ever will. But, you know, I think, you know, that's kind of where I come from. And we just got to be mindful for it. And as well as relying on legislation and governments to do the best, I think we all have a moral duty, those of us involved, even in the early days of some of the applications, to make sure that we take a stand and only get involved in projects that do good and provide benefit.
I think you made a really interesting point, which is expecting perfection in a system when we don't expect it in ourselves. There's something in that, right? And that you know, there's that balance between sort of regulation and constricting innovation, and yet human beings have to fail in order to learn. So we have to have imperfection in order to seek better outcomes or change things. There needs to be learning, and learning comes from not necessarily always doing the right things. So I just think there's that kind of interesting balance between, you know, humans are imperfect, which is why we've evolved, innovated, and we are today. You know, these technologies only exist through innovation, through trying and failing and trying again. So I think there's something about, you know, not overly regulating this to sort of stifle its potential, because the opportunities of what it could drive for unlocking the limitations of human capability, quite frankly, to do these sorts of processing of large volumes of data to change things like outcomes for health, as a really great example. Would be shame to see that constrained through too much fear, right? So I think, you know, I wondered if, Dennis, Nick, there was another point just around, you know, where would you draw the line? And then when we dig into sort of fear and regulation in a bit more detail, but I just wondered if you had a comment on that. Maybe Dennis, if you've got a point.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, working with Nexus members, for instance, talking about regulation is very difficult in the terms of, you know, I agree. There's kind of this trade-off between, on one hand, innovation, and on the other hand, you know, how do you make sure that certain values are preserved? But I think by just early engagement with companies, this can be resolved. There is something like the Collingridge dilemma in ethics, which says that you're always either too early or too late when it comes to ethics and technology, which means that when you first come and you say, oh, these might be positive, but these might be problems, they'll say, well, we haven't developed the technology yet, so why would you worry? And then the technology develops and you come again, you say, well, these are my concerns because this is happening. And then they'll say, well, you're too late now, the technology hasn't developed. And I don't completely believe that has to be the case. It's a bit binary, and we like to be binary, but that's why I'd like to put this out, because you mentioned domain expertise and that's something that I think, what I see, for instance, with Slingshot or other members, by involving everybody, that's so important, because it will keep developing. Regulation will implement now. You know, if you make it very strict, it might not be relevant anymore in 10 years' time. And we have to be flexible in that sense. And I think if we have learned something about what has happened, look at the whole thing about fake news, etc., is that we need to be flexible in legislation. I think that accountability is something that should be much more at the forefront. People like to hide behind AI and technology as an excuse, like it wasn't me, it was the algorithm. But that's something we've been doing for years, right? It wasn't me, it's not allowed for because of religious or traditional intentions. You know, we'll hide behind that instead of taking that accountability of, okay, but why do you make that decision? And I think, and Xandra, I think you mentioned that it's about, when we're working with AI and developing algorithms, we should wonder for ourselves, would you accept this from a human? You know, if this decision is being made by an algorithm, how would you respond if this was a human sat in front of you making that same decision for you, and how would you respond in that sense? And putting that human central in that respect is indeed very important. So in terms of regulation, I think you need to take into account that precautionary principle, that the risks should never outweigh the rewards. If there's too high of a risk, sometimes it's better to just not go forward than to go, especially if there's scientific discourse. So if people can't agree on what the best approach out is, then maybe you shouldn't start working on it, or do some more investigation first. And accountability will be very important. It's if you make this decision, or you have this algorithm make this decision, who's accountable for it? Which I think will be very important. And in terms of regulation, I think this has to be a continuous process of scrutiny. So being able to reflect on what has happened, was it good or not, put it in the right perspective, and then adapt it to make it again future-proof. Because that's something that's very difficult in the current situation, where maybe outdated legislation is no longer relevant here, which in a lot of you know, social cases is what's going on right now. And I think especially in a field that is developing rapidly at the moment, and that is showing us how relevant it is to be more flexible, of course, regulation should then be just as flexible. So it's better to have this ongoing conversation between a wide group of people, you know, not just the industry, but also academics, government, and also representations from either, if it's in medicine, from patient groups, or whether it's certain charities, but just to take all of these into account when you're trying to implement something.
And I think that this accountability and the choice piece really come together for me when I think about where AI meets industry or where AI meets education, health. It doesn't really matter. But if you're building a model, but it's still the choice of the organisation or the individual to take action on a recommendation of a film you should watch, right? We're all really comfortable with. We'll take a recommendation, but we'll choose whether we take action on it. But actually, that's a really safe place for us to be around, you know, where is the accountability? Well, the accountability is, yes, the model needs to be doing its job of making recommendations that people trust and believe are useful, hopefully, and they can take action on. But ultimately, the choice is whether they take action really helps to kind of make accountability for those that, you know, for both sides, right? The model builders and those taking action on those decisions. Feels like that choice bit, as opposed to automating decisions, feels more like the place that we can be comfortably around the ethics of this. Would that be fair to say? Does that feel like a
Yes, no, of course, and that's of course dependent on so many factors. You know, looking at just data quality and data validity, the amount of bias that can be found in data that is there, and if we don't acknowledge that, then obviously an algorithm is very often made to make decisions. But we decide what we put in and what we want to get out, or well, at least we decide what we want to put in. We don't always know what ends up when we run it through. But when we already think about it logically and we're like, okay, this is not the result what we want, but how is that? And what can we find in the data? Do we have all the data? Do we have all the users? I used an example yesterday about research where someone once proposed measuring poverty by using mobile phone data, which is could be really interesting. But then I think the poorest among society don't have access to mobile phones. So already you lose kind of a valuable group. So sometimes using this sort of, you know, it can play a large part, but we shouldn't forget that there's always things missing, and those cannot always be solved by using, you know, AI or big data in that sense. It sometimes just require us going out there and talking to people, you know, creating awareness and making sure that people use something. You can create a wonderful app, but if people don't know that that app exists or are hesitant to use it because of a dogma surrounding that topic, then just creating that app won't solve it. You'll have to go and explain to people why they should use it. And that why part is very important in relation to also then relating that back to accountability, your intentions behind it.
Yeah, the intentions and the subsequent actions, right? two sides of what go, the inputs and the outputs, and what happens with both, right? If I was to summarize it simply. Whilst we're on this kind of how do we manage the fear and thinking about regulation on the limitation, Nick, I wondered if you had some thoughts on this that you wanted to come on to.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So I like Ken's sort of view on the guiding principles of doing this stuff. You know, I don't know if you've seen there's an institute called the Centre for Digital Built Britain, and they've come out with the Gemini principles, which are not so far away from your views, Ken. So, you know, the work you're doing has to have purpose, public good is in there, trust. So, you know, having a set of guiding principles which people can sign up to because they think they're a good idea is a big part of this. And there's also the education piece. So, you know, you can educate people to be able to use the algorithms that are AI, but you can also educate people to interrogate and ask questions of the output. So it comes back to the black boxness of some of these techniques. And because it's evolved so quickly, we are catching up a little bit as society. You know, and it comes back to what Dennis was saying a bit earlier. You know, if fundamentally is what you're doing right or not, and that's got to be a huge part of, you know, general education and understanding of the algorithms. And then the other key issue that exists here is that, as I said at the beginning, these algorithms are very data hungry. And a lot of the ethics and problems that we'll face are around the data themselves. So are they securely held? Are they used with consent? Are they being used in ways that people would be happy with their personal data being used? And we have very good structures for doing this kind of thing usually, but people potentially can get quite excited about using AI algorithms. Those things need to still be in place. So I think having guiding principles, frameworks, established ways of doing things, people understanding what's good and bad and moral and not moral is the way that we're going to keep this all in check. It's new ways of doing things that we've been trying to do for a long time. And so opening it up a little bit and taking away the fear is through all of those things, really.
Yeah, there's a lot of education. You think about people's different perceptions of what good or bad is. That's quite a difficult area, right? And guiding principles are a good kind of steer. But even below that, when you start to get into the detail, I mean, we were all on the receiving end of, people just behaving because everyone else behaved that same way in financial crash, right? They just, well, everyone else is doing it, so it can't be bad. But if actually you dug into the what they were doing and got them to understand and really think about it, maybe they would have had a different view. But I just think that's quite a hard area, isn't it? That education of what's good and what's bad. And often the people that are on the front line of understanding the consequences of a decision are probably the best placed people to determine what is likely to be a good outcome or a bad outcome for those people that they serve in whatever context, which I always feel like if you want to have a best example of understanding what the implications are of a decision, then the people that actually have to implement the consequences or receive the consequences of that decision are the best served to understand it, as opposed to the people a lot further up from that, perhaps, that are lost in just, well, this is the way we do things around here, as in this isn't a bad thing. And that always kind of feels like a kind of bridge, a big bridge that we have to cross with this sort of stuff, because guiding principles will never get down to that layer fundamentally. They'll be too high level. Am I making sense? Does that? I just think there's quite a big bridge, and
Yeah, and there's a real equity to kind of access to, not necessarily being able to work with these technologies, but in the education to understand the implications of using them. And I think it's that bridge that needs to be bridged, and removing the black boxness of the work is a key part of that. I know it's certainly in the AI roadmap is broadening out education, and it's got to be part of making this stuff more accessible and trustworthy to the general public, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it probably brings you onto your hobby horse again, Ken. Sorry.
I was just going to say one of the pitfalls as well that I've noticed that things get into, and I think chatbots is a really good example of this. So you've seen there's a chatbot called Replica that you can have, and you can turn it into your friend. You ask it questions, it learns obviously as it goes forward, and it starts asking. But I try anyone not to use it for 10 minutes without starting to have an argument with it, because it's not a human, and mimicry is a really big problem. So where we try and use these processes to mimic humans, then that's the sort of thing which rubs people up in the wrong way, but also degrades that trust really, really quickly. And one of those things where I was shouting my TV was a Tomorrow's World type program where they were talking about robots replacing care workers in old folks' homes. So the old people would have someone to talk to, and you screaming back at it is no, that's a line we mustn't cross. That's what we absolutely shouldn't be doing. People need human contact, and it's very dangerous when we get down to that level of mimicry in particular. So that's something that I'm always a bit cautious about.
I feel like we're sort of getting over that mimicry bit when it comes to AI though. So for a long time it was about the Turing Test. Can you trick a human into thinking that you're a human? And
I didn't dare mention that. I was going to mention the Turing Test, and I didn't dare mention it in front of you, because I think even Alan Turing would disagree with that these days.
Yeah. So I mean, so it was, the test was passed in 2014. Eugene pretended to be a 13-year-old boy and tricked some judges in a competition, and I think we've sort of moved on from there a little bit, because It's now about whether you can use those AI interactions in an efficient way rather than trying to make them mimic humans. And I think that's quite good in some ways, you know, that we don't necessarily we're not trying to do the mimicry as much as what, you know, in the past when the limitations of the technology were there and it was a sort of unattainable target in many ways.
It's I don't know, I like that. For me, it's a very difficult thing to talk about, in the sense that what I think how AI develops and becomes more human-esque, you know, I think it's already a reflection of how we think we work. I mean, the reason that it's still difficult for able to create an artificial human brain in the sense of digitally is because we still need to understand how we weight decision-making processes, right? How does flash decision-making work? Everything can point into one direction, but one of your close friends says, don't do that, you still won't do it. Well, all logic would point into that direction. And in terms of, you know, robots and care homes, it depends. I think it strongly depends. It depends on how we look at ourselves as humans, how we accept that. But for instance, don't know if you've seen the movie Artificial Intelligence, where, you know, the child is replaced by AI, and I dare you not to cry when the, spoiler alert by the way, but when the mother abandons the child in the woods. And it teaches us something about, well, where does that cutoff point come when it truly becomes indistinguishable, and should that be a problem? I mean, there's just as there's humans we don't like to be our nurse, there probably will be robots we don't like to be our nurse. And what if that could be catered completely to what you like, to your treatment? If we talk about individualized medicine, I think the closest we can get to that is by seeing how we can use robotization and maybe AI in order to comfort you in that way. What if, I know one of the things that has been helping a lot with Alzheimer's disease is by rebuilding, for instance, in the Netherlands, I've seen these front doors that they used to have when they were younger. And they rebuild like all the cities where they used to live. But what if you'd be able to actually remake people from that time? You know, what would that do for the healthcare of those people if they'd be able to see, for instance, their husband or their wife or their kids or people they grew up with or people they recognize? It might be a very scary thought, but on the other hand, it might also be, if it improves their lives or their perception of their lives, then why shouldn't we? I think that's a debate we should just be having is, you know, can we decide that for ourselves? At the moment, maybe, but maybe in the future we'll see they're so indistinguishable from humans that they might even outperform us in terms of empathy.
I can see the faces of like, wow, you've just transported people into that kind of future of, I'm imagining almost having a VR headset on and being able to see people that I've not seen for years, and just asking myself the questions you're talking. Would I want to do that? And if I was at a point in life where that would make me happier and give me a better quality of life, then should that not be my choice? And just going back to choices, that just because we can create something, does it need to be, you know, could it be used? Well, who are the best people to determine whether that's used or not? Well, surely we should be empowering the people that will benefit from that. And back to I keep coming back to the people that are impacted by these decisions and interventions. Surely they're at the heart of all of this. You know, the people that are impacted by these innovations, they're the ones that will tell you whether this is going to change their lives. We should be asking them first, as opposed to doing it over here somewhere away from them. Yeah,
I think there is some danger in these things as well. So to go to Harry Potter, I think it was in the chamber of something or other, because I didn't study it quite as well as some people did, but where Harry could go and see a mirror and talk to his family, and in the end he literally has to be pulled back to reality from that. So I think, yeah, there's some really interesting arguments to be had there, Dennis.
Yeah, it's the perception, right, and the intention, because on the other hand, we do use medication to normalize people as well, and to keep them in a certain state that they feel comfortable in. So if we can do it biologically, why can't we use other methods? But I agree, it's dangerous, but that's, again, and I think, Zeno, you said that it's for who are we doing it, and how do they feel about being confronted with it?
And let's be honest, we've made lots of interventions, medical, societal, which you could argue the same, just as you have done with kind of keeping people in a medicated state for their well-being. And this is just a technology equivalent, right? It's just a different intervention, same outcome. So yeah, big debate on that one, but I think we might come back out of that rabbit hole for a second, if that's okay. But I think a really interesting rabbit hole to go into, and really, I think, presents the kind of challenge of ethics and that good and bad. There are so many dimensions to good and bad, and from whose perspective? And the perspective of the person that's maybe on the receiving end of that, perspective of society and the implications of the wider society, or even for the people that are kind of applying those interventions and might that change how they apply them. I mean, crikey, it's a complex area. We have actually had a question from the audience, and I was just going to bring it up. It's a chap we've worked with for many years, actually, Stephen Thurston, and he was asking about, and it's sort of going back to this technology space that we're in now, which is, it's technology historically has been a mix of software and processing power, so kind of hardware and cloud computing. And the question here is AI just another layer, or is it part of that? So, I mean, it's quite a technical question, I think, but there's something about is it on top of these two things? Is it another layer of technology, or is it just part of software and processing? Sorry, a tough question to throw at you.
I'll just shoot from the hip first, and then
see what happens. Right?
I think it is well, is it separately? I don't think so, in the sense that if how I understand it, it is a form of code. It is, of course, coding. So it's just using different programs in order to write based on the data that you put into it, at least at the moment. I think, as I said before, it's that umbrella term for a lot of different applications. And it's just knowing, okay, if we talk about AI, I think sometimes we have to be more specific about what application are we talking about, and then you'll understand that it's okay. You need, for instance, for image recognition, you'll need certain hardware and software that is different from, for instance, as Nick said, the more easy AI, which can work with probably much cheaper hardware and it's much easier to code. So I think it's very much dependent on what are you aiming to do, and then looking at the hardware, software requirements, and the skills in order to program it in the right way. So it might be even that umbrella term of being it's having the right skills, it's having the right hardware, and it's having the right software.
Yeah, I mean, it is at the moment, it's a sort of technology-driven application of data science, right? It's at the moment, that feels to me that's where it is, which is, it is processing and software with people with skills to do that, which may be no different from building software itself, right? People that know how to write code and turn an application into life. I just wonder if anybody else any thoughts. Can AI become something as a layer on top, or will it always stay in this kind of as another aspect of technology?
Just to make the point about some of the new devices that we now take for granted. So things like smart thermostats are technology, they're hardware solutions with a software which does the things, but without the software, they'd be really boring. They'd just be thermostats. And the line between the software and the hardware is starting to blur, because the AI can be built into things, which means that it is a set of code and algorithms that do things with data, but you can integrate them within the technology. And when we come to quantum computing and the next leaps in technology, I'm imagining that the AI will be built it will be integrated with the hardware more, because we're going to have less control over what we do with the software, if that makes sense, because the scale is going to be so much larger. So the automation of what the AI can do will probably be part of the hardware solution as well as the software. But that's another, trying to gaze into the future, which maybe we shouldn't be doing so much of.
I think you can gaze into the future by looking at the recent past and not too recent past as well. So I'm old enough to have studied this at university. My first job was writing algorithms. We happily call that machine learning AI these days, because it's been given those labels. I think that there is a bit of a holy trinity that has happened over the last 5-10 years, though, which brings those things together. One is the rise of SaaS businesses. So those SaaS businesses where they didn't hold the data, and didn't have all of the data from multiple companies, multiple organizations, multiple events, now do have access to that data. Computing power, exactly as you said, and met with really the resurgence of people wanting to be data driven. You know, that's a bit of a holy trinity that have come together to form what's happening at the moment. I think that the next journey that we see ourselves starting to go on particularly is seeing these tools more as enablers. So there's only so much Python, there's only so much R that people want to go out and write. Actually, it's about tools which enable people to do those things without having to code. So the whole low code, no code journey that we're starting to see really get momentum, not just in the UK, but across the globe, means that we actually can start to see these things more as tools and more as enablers and bring in other people. And that's the heart of the journey for us. Sorry, there's someone at the door as well, perfectly. There's my dog will bark a little bit. So, you know, that sort of being able to bring and sort of, we talk about the citizen data scientist, and we mean it very, very carefully. What we really mean is those tools being allowed to be used by a wider audience. And that's definitely where education has a role to play and a role to evolve, to allow people to get the best out of the tools that are coming on the market. And it shouldn't really be just the data science ivory tower anymore. That's the thing which keeps this feeling like it's a black box and it's something magical that people do. It's making sure that the tools become available in a way that people can get the best from them. And yeah, and again, that's the sort of pathway that we see ourselves and lots of other IT companies on at the moment.
It's almost like, and as I said before, I see technology as a representation of ourselves, sometimes maybe a little bit too deep for other people's comfort. But it's almost like a nature-nurture discussion in forms of technology, right? What's leading what in the terms of, is it how we designed it, or is it how it's taught to learn of the data input that we put in? And in that sense, I think it'll be very interesting to see how, by understanding AI better, how that can teach us to understand ourselves better as well, in terms of how we make decisions and how we can transfer these skills towards other people.
I was reflecting on a company that we've been speaking to lately, and thinking about how they're taking small steps on automating human thinking or decisions in a low risk way, but actually it's redirecting, a bit like you think about the chatbot that's doing mimicry. So if you just take a step back from that, actually we don't want to speak to a chatbot, we want to speak to someone who's an expert, but it being an algorithm that's triaging a question to get it to the right human for an answer. And all it's doing is signposting them to the best person, the most likely best person to answer that question, frankly. And actually that is, you know, improving anything that the way in which it's like a customer service tool, if you imagine, that is a step back from a chatbot, is a better experience, but it's still getting the right people speaking to the right people. And I think there is that kind of, you know, it doesn't have to be a whole kind of implementation of decisioning. It's just about perhaps triaging. We've been in lending from the start, and you know, that was a lot around, you know, deciding based on risk profiling and scorecarding, you know, whether or not people are most likely to pay back a loan. Quite frankly, you know, that is, you know, this has been around a long time. We talked about this at the start. This is not new. Some of these algorithms, we've been applying it in industry for a long time, but actually this is sometimes just about, you know, what are the things that are low risk that just actually improve an experience, in this case a customer experience or customer service. You know, I think we can put small AI interventions into existing infrastructure and technology, but have a really big impact on outcomes. You know, we're not having to automate the whole decision-making process. It does not have to be a chatbot. It could just be sending people in the right direction. So I just, you know, sometimes I think we forget to talk about that. You know, maybe, I think Nick mentioned it right at the start. I think narrow AI was the phrase that you used, Nick, that narrow AI is a good way to win trust and build that kind of confidence that these things can take away some of those kind of human intensive things that perhaps are not the best use of our time. I had another question actually that I wanted to throw at you. Sorry to put you, I know it's always difficult when we're throwing a new question at you, but last week Google fired Margaret Mitchell, who was the head of the AI ethics division. This is the second person in so many weeks. Why do you think this happened? what is behind this, and what is driving these events?
Yeah, so it's developing into quite a complex story, and there may be all sorts of politics happening at Google. So putting the sort of politics aside, really, the general answer from Google on this is the fact that actually it's about data and a trust issue. So where data was collected inappropriately and data was shared outside of the organization, and I think in their representation, it is a quick response to making sure that people know that they understand and value the data. And at the heart of it, I challenge people all the time. They'll use phrases like my data, our data, when they're talking about the data they hold in their systems. And actually, what they really mean is we've got thousands of data points that relate to others or us as individuals, and we're really talking about their data. So it's so incredibly important that that data is held, used, and directed as it was required, or as that person gave that data either willingly or unwillingly, that it's used appropriately. And I think it's a measure of just how important businesses see that trust from that point of view, that they are trying to take these sorts of actions. And also, I think the underlying as well is it does show that, where we're talking about ethical debates and ethical questions, the biggest businesses out there, the Googles, the Amazons, the Apples, they're really, really struggling with these questions as well at the moment. And I think, underlying that is they're not necessarily got all the answers, and they do need input and help. So that's kind of how I take that story at the moment.
Anybody else have a view on that, just once it's been asked? Don't worry if you haven't.
I just think it's very difficult in the sense that you'll never get to the true story, in the sense that one will always claim one thing and the other will always claim the other, which sounds like a very evasive answer, I know, but it's very difficult to get to the validity of the story. So the news will publish, of course, that what is most interesting. So they'll publish, oh, this is the second person to leave that committee after the first one left, and they both made remarks about more diversity that has to be within their research, and almost hinting, but not exclaiming that is the reason that they were let go, which of course is something that it's not spoken out but is hinted at, and you never know. That's very difficult. When you read Google's statement, it says they broke code of conduct, which in any case, if that's a reason that is in your company to let someone go, then that's of course a valid reason to let someone go. So it makes it, I think it makes it very difficult to say, was it the right or wrong decision? I think that indeed, as Ken said, these large corporations, of course, are struggling with the same kind of issues that everyone is struggling with in the field. And that it only shows that we have to be more open in that sense about how we work, why we make certain decisions. I remember when I was, every time I would write a research proposal for Horizon or somewhere else, I would always ask, like, what if it were different? How could it be different? You make this decision now, but what could be all the alternatives? And I think by being more open about what is happening at a company, by showing these are decisions we're making, and without necessarily giving away, business intelligence, would be a big step forward. I know that in the National Data Strategy, there was to talk about the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation. And I think that having that center, but actually having localized chapters of something like that, where people come together and discuss these sorts of problems and discuss methodology of companies, will already make it less controversial of someone just being sent away that is working on a very delicate topic, I think.
Yeah, and it is a sort of interesting area. What is the truth behind a story is hard when we're observing it from the outside, right? But I think there is, it has obviously sparked interest, and I think observing that and how people interpret that is almost important for us to make sure that we're speaking to whatever concerns things like that may raise, and people's confidence in the way these larger organisations or any organisation are using technology or being challenged on that, I think would be fair to say as well. I have a question from the audience, if that's okay. It's from Claire Garside from Digital Access West Yorkshire. I'm just going to read out what she's put here. She's put, our partnership with Panintelligence sparked a new way of supporting people across the Leeds city region with digital access. Tomorrow, Claire and Jack are going to be sharing a pledge for Leeds and for the city around digital capabilities. It's broader than access and digital competencies, and what's being talked about now will fit into digital empowerment and positive attitudes. Probably too complex to answer now, but what is the basic understanding needed of the issues we're talking about today for adults and children? It's really thinking about the education piece. So if you can answer sort of, each citizen should be able to ... You know, what are we saying is the next step of education to help people on this, on understanding what can feel like a really complex area if we're trying to get this understood. Does that question make sense to everyone? And thank you, Claire, by the way. And I'm sure everybody on this call will be interested to hear that agenda and pledge. And I'm sure if you send that across, I'll share it with the panelists today, so they're aware. So I don't know who would like to pick that up. So each citizen should be able to ...
There's definitely a long answer somewhere, but I think the shorter answer is every citizen should be able to challenge decisions made, whether they're with an algorithm or by a human. And that's not easy to do, but it comes down to having some level of understanding about how decisions are made and what the processes in that are, you know. So just telling someone that algorithms make the decisions isn't good enough. It's, you know, making them aware that there are uncertainties involved with algorithmic decision making, and that, you know, humans need to train these algorithms before they're able to make any decisions at all. It's that whole piece around unmasking the black box of algorithms. I think that's the short answer.
Can we quote that answer? Because I 100% just agree with that. It's about, indeed, not just understanding, it's understanding decision making at whole and demystifying it a bit. It's about, one of the things I would always teach is about rhetorical fallacies that can be used in research, such as cherry picking, such as hasty generalizations, correlation versus causation. And it's about understanding almost just basic argumentation. And it's just as valid as understanding decisions from algorithms as it is reading a news article. And you know, I like the analogy of using a Facebook post as a source for your data is like buying your medication of someone off the corner of the street. You know, it could be that it's valid, but it's about, would you trust it in that sense? And being able to understand better how people come to a certain decision and being able to discern between valid and invalid, at least as good as possible, by understanding how you can filter through those answers, I think will be indeed very important.
To be boring, I can nothing but agree with it. You know, this is about trust and fairness. You know, absolutely, and it's how you position that. And I think an analogy I'll give out, just to give a slightly different perspective, is on a weather forecast. So my mum, God bless her, will tell me what the weather's going to be like next week, and I'm like, how do you know it's going to snow on Thursday next week? Nobody knows it's going to snow on Thursday next week, and it's almost giving the right caveats with the information that you give out. So I always get a bit upset with the long range weather forecast that actually, you know, tomorrow's weather, maybe they're 80% certain it's going to be. It then drops to 60%, 40% to the week's range. Maybe there's a very stable weather pattern over us, which lets us know that absolutely they know what's going to happen. So they might be 80% confident, but they also at the same time they might be 10% confident. And it's allowing people to understand that. And I haven't mentioned Tesla to this point. I don't think I probably have, but the analogy I'd give is the self-driving, the route to self-driving cars, and how it takes people on that journey, in the fact that you've got an iPad on the screen which is showing you a visual representation of how it's making decisions and what those decisions mean. And what it makes sure is that you're always aware that you need to hold onto the steering wheel, and when it's better and when it's worse at decisions. And that's exactly the same thing that you need to be able to convey to people. It's almost like putting an energy warning on it. You know, when you buy your fridge, this is an A-star rated prediction because we're really confident that this is going to happen. It's that same sort of way that you communicate it very simply with people so that they understand that this prediction has a degree of uncertainty with it, and how we declare what that uncertainty might be. And exactly as you're saying, Nick, it's about challenge. You know, one, you've got to be able to accept challenge, and two, you've got to be able to provide information on the challenge. And it's why using the right models appropriately is also important. So the final analogy I give you, I love a good story. You'll work this out pretty soon. But in the world of finance, we were not able to use neural net as an example for credit bureau decisions. So we couldn't just turn around and say, actually, the answer that got spit out was the fact that you can't have this loan. You had to be able to provide evidence in terms of how the decision was made. Hence why we used either regression trees or we used scorecards, because you had to be able to explain the decision, why it was made, and allow people to challenge it. And that becomes really, really important. And there's a real challenge to how you try and educate a population with that. But I think that's small bites of the cherry, making sure that things go out with very clear direction in terms of how they'd be used. You know, think about, you know, you're asking them to eat the mushroom, give them the information about how safe that is and you know how they should use it. I think that would be my advice, really.
I do think we've educated the population, or it feels to me the population are educated around the fact that their data is their data, and if they can request to be removed from a database, and they can request to have any information about them, right? I think it feels to me that is something that is broadly understood by adults, maybe less so children, I don't know, I'm guessing here, but that does feel like it's broadly understood. And I just wonder if there's a big leap from that or not to understanding, well, you know, having a right to understand how a decision has been made, and how you might ask that question about how a decision has been made. Show me how this decision has been made. Give me the information about how this decision has been made. Are we not just educating people to take that, you know, that next step, and that we're helping people to empower them that they have a right to understand? If that makes it, I just wonder if that's all we're talking about here.
I think so. It's what I like when Nick mentioned challenging is we're already doing that, right? We're challenging why we still have certain street names, why we are glorifying, you know, in some parts colonialism, and why it should be things be the way they are. And I think hopefully we'll be able to fine-tune that and be able to use that momentum to also say, okay, this in general is a skill that we need to embrace more. It's about changing the way we educate, right? Very often it was just because of the access to data was so difficult, you just needed to remember the data yourself. So you weren't taught to discern between different types of data, where you can find different types of data, then figuring out which one was good or not good. It was just, this is your book, read this book, remember that book, and I'll test you on that book. You couldn't challenge if you write on your answer on a question on a paper, I do not agree because I do not feel this literature represents what I think is right, then you would just fail your test. And I think we still have some catch up to do in terms of, okay, all this information is available, everything, so much more is digitized. Of course, there's another discussion about having people access to the right technology, which is of course something completely different. It's that digital poverty gap that we need to bridge and make sure everybody has access. But then in that sense, data is everywhere, and we need to be able to teach people not to just remember the data they see to take that for granted, but to be able to, okay, this is what one person writes, what does somebody else write? And how do you weigh that one opinion or one research compared to the other?
Yeah, so how do we challenge inherent bias, right? And there's bias in our history books, let's face it. History is just people's perspective of past events from their point of view.
Actually.
So we then are educated on people's perspectives, which are inherently biased. And I think, you know, how do we help individuals or citizens to be able to challenge decisions by understanding that maybe there is a bias which may have an impact on them, so that they are able to push up that kind of
and learn to disagree again. Yeah. I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think
be empowered to disagree. Yeah.
You told a great story, Jenny, yesterday. Oh, sorry, Nick.
I was going to say, but with data and algorithms, I think it is still very intimidating. So, you know, the people that understand their data are generally educated in data. So we know GDPR means that we have to opt in. We can submit a subject access request to a company to find out what they've got, but I don't think that everybody knows that they can do that. and the algorithm is the next step. You know, the algorithm's made the decision. I do think that it's going to take an awful lot of work to get people to the stage where they understand that there's so much uncertainty involved there. So I completely agree that it's the next step on from the data argument, but I think there's an awful lot of work to be done to get enough people up to the right level to be able to do that.
Are we starting with the data conversation before we can start with the AI conversation? I think is what you're saying. And that's where we start. You know, let's talk about data. What is it? And how is it being used? Maybe.
Yeah. When you mention it, it's almost like, you know, how you have those companies that will take your, if you, for instance, will flying through an airport and they lose your luggage or you're delayed, and you have these intermediate companies or these immediately counseling that can help you to reclaim your luggage because you don't know how the system works. It's almost having like these sorts of foundations or research, you know, what you are doing already, to be more prevalent and saying, you know, this is what is actually going on, and this is, you know, come to us with these questions, and will be able to help you further with solutions, or at least like a nudge into the right direction.
Yeah, and that's a nudge, right? That comes back to the choice thing. So if we're trying out technologies to see if the data tells us anything useful, because I think something we always say when we talk to people for the first time is, you know, it's you know, a model might tell you something, but whether it's useful, whether it's something you can do something about or even should do something about, still has to be determined. And therefore, you know, we can build lots of different models, but there are some decisions that always need to be made as to whether that is actually going to change things for the better, and actually whether you should be using that based on perhaps some of the things that it presents, which may cause challenge. And I think there is, you know, a lot around that subject, and I think getting people to understand that by giving them access to tools so they can start to see the challenges around having to, is this model right? Does it tell me something useful? Number one, yes, no. Is it something that I can do something about, want to do something about, should do something about, you know? And people then really start to understand that quickly when you take them through something. You may bring it alive and make that, you know, AI becomes real very quickly. And I think we've got to do more of that, and that's how we educate, because then they start to understand the challenge, and therefore, you know, it makes more sense. I do have another question. I don't know, Ken, if you wanted to jump onto that at all. Or...
It just got me thinking, because Dennis told us a great story, and it's one I'm going to pinch from you, Dennis, which is we're assuming that all decisions make sense by these things as well, and sometimes it can feel like such an outlandish decision. You feel that your fairness is so badly robbed, you don't know quite where to turn. So you were talking about the chess, you know, so a whole load of people are watching a chess game, and you tell it better than me, Dennis, but essentially someone wins a game of chess by making an illegal chess move at the end, and everyone sitting around you, you look around at the group expecting everyone to call out that chess move, but everyone just goes, oh, well done, and congratulates the winner. And you're then feeling grossly mistreated by that. And it's that same sort of perspective from the AI. What happens when something which is quite human and can happen to us happens to the sort of decisioning piece or the AI piece? It was just a really interesting story, and I thought it was worth raising today.
Yeah, and I think how do we enable and empower people to challenge, but also perhaps when they feel there is an injustice in something, how do they even go about doing something about that, or understanding, or being able to challenge that? You know, how do you even challenge what you think is inherent justice? I mean, it's fine when you say we have scorecards and lending, you have to prove how that decision was made so they can come back and challenge. I don't think we have that same discipline across industry now in all areas, and something about that needs to come in.
Exactly. It's like if you have automated application processes for visa, for instance. And by coincidence, we were watching Ye Ballet yesterday. It's a very good movie, definitely recommend it. But it's about two boys in India that set out to become ballet dancers, and then they want to go to the US. But then it became almost impossible to get a visa because they didn't have bank account, etc., because of course they come from a completely different demographic group there. They didn't have that. But it shows you how you already start, how if you put that in an automated decision process, you just get an automatic cancellation, while, you know, the story behind it, the human behind the decision, is much more interesting to look at, and to be thinking, okay, maybe we need to accept that there's cultural and regional differences, but how do you put that unpredictability of those factors into an algorithm? How can you make that? How can you make sure that they understand that there's these differences, and how can you make sure that they can be like, okay, this is what or indeed, if you put the human in the loop, where do you put it, and what actually matters? Because we'll blame the algorithm, but the algorithm is probably doing what we want it to do. So how do we deal with those processes that maybe have to be more humanized instead of automated?
Yes, I love that. Where do we put the human in the loop? And when we think about guiding principles, there's kind of guiding principles from an ethics and kind of the purpose of models and the intention of them. But I think there's some guiding principles around, you know, where the human is in the loop in the decisions about what the model is doing and the decisions about the output. You know, there almost feels like there's some guiding principles around that. Is that what you're sort of saying here, Dennis? That there's probably some critical points at which we need to say, you know, that somebody's put an eye on this.
Exactly. And I also know a very positive example of that, for instance. So when I came to this country a little bit over a year ago, you also have to have a bank account for your salary. But to have a bank account, you need a national insurance number. But that can take a couple of weeks while you're already working. So it was a pretty complicated process. But luckily, before me, very smart people already knew that. And that's, for instance, I use one of those financial institutions that, exactly because they were an immigrant and couldn't get that, started their organization, which says, you know, you don't have to hand this over. You know, you only submit the data that is relevant for now, and only for certain decisions we'll ask you to provide more data or more verifications. So you get that chance only when you want to do major decisions, is it when they request more information from you. So a little bit more, you know, need to know or fit for purpose kind of thinking behind it. And that made sure that I could have a bank account. Well, I don't think they were officially called that, but have an account, and then at least be able to get your salary. And that's a very useful application of AI. It's just being, okay, we'll just use this data from you, and we're able to capture that from you by using photography, by using these sorts of initial, you know, initial data sets that we require from you. And then if we need more in the future, we can always ask it then. But there's just, because of that technology, they're able to capture the essential part. And I think that's just a brilliant way of, you know, okay, this is a problem. How can I use this technology to create a decent solution that actually values what people are going through? So there's a lot of positive, you know, stories about that as well.
And I think the application use cases are so huge. It can be, you could take any area of industry or you know, education, healthcare, any part of society, frankly, every stage of life, and think of, you know, an unlimited number of use cases. And I think that's it, because it all is inherently around solving a problem. You know, this is about, you know, think of a problem, and you can probably use data to kind of help us improve an outcome by just understanding the problem better and driving different solutions towards the problem using AI. I do have a question from the audience, though. Chris Plant has asked, how do you think we can better train people to use AI techniques properly? And I think, Nick, you sort of talked earlier, right at the start, about, you know, people having the skills, frankly, to be able to, you talked about, you know, good understanding of data efficacy, as well as principles and the skills to know what a good kind of model looks like, and that just the principles of that. So how do we train people better so that we can get to that the techniques are used by everyone in a better way?
Yeah, I mean, from an academic point of view first, I think that the skills training in this area has increased fairly rapidly. So we can get people onto conventional courses, so you know, undergraduate, postgraduate, and certainly there's been a huge ballooning of postgraduate courses on data science. We've got a couple at Leeds, and they're popping up all over the place. But there are probably some more innovative ways of doing it, to be honest. There are a bit of a plug for Leeds Institute for Data Analytics. We have an internship program which runs every year on a competitive basis. So we have interns for a 12-month period. They get paid, and they do 2 projects in collaboration with business. And that's a really good way of getting people skilled up, learning how to use these, you know, AI techniques in real applied settings. So that's one way of doing it. And then kind of staying with the academic, PhD programs that allow people to get a real good understanding in this is great. But then, of course, we've got the more broad education going on, and that comes through kind of on-the-job skills training. So, the kind of level 7 apprenticeship in AI, businesses that are adopting these technologies should be training their staff in how to use them. And even if it's staff who are not, directly implementing the algorithms, I think probably still should be training other members of staff to at least understand where in the hierarchy of decision making they sit. So I think there's a whole load of formal training which can go on and is going on with the universities, but then there's on the jobs and skills training. But of course, there's it's like the grassroots learning how to code is now is part of the school curriculum, which is fantastic. And I think getting kids to understand, again, comes back to this understanding how algorithms work, understanding how to challenge them, demystifying, probably should start there. So there's the kind of school kids, grassroots, all the way up to the very sort of focused PhD programs. There's a whole spectrum of training that needs to be done here, and probably needs to be accelerated, actually.
Yeah, I just had a question on that, actually, thinking about sort of basic skills and the pipeline in education. Where should it sit? Is this in maths? Is this in computing science? Where does AI find its home in early years education?
Well, that's a good question.
Do you think that's part of the problem as to why it's not found its way into early years education?
I mean, inherently for me, it's in computing, IT, whatever it's called at that level, but it might also permeate into maths in order to make some of the maths problems more interesting in real world. But it's a good question, because actually it's not very easy to answer that.
No, I was just thinking, I got introduced to it through the humanities faculty. So, so not the place where you expect it, but yeah, that's where I got it. I think because it's also so it's involving more and more disciplines, so it's only bound to be relevant for every discipline. So yeah,
it needs to find a home, doesn't it? If we're going to get it through.
Well, it can be at home elsewhere, right? It can be this kind of like introduction course that we can give in every field and just made relevant for that field if you want to. But yeah, it's difficult to see exactly what discipline it is.
Yeah. What's your thought?
I think from our experience, we took on a graduate last year, a graduate placement of a data scientist, and she's gone on to do her PhD now. And it was a very useful year both for her and for us, I think. So yeah, I think given the fact that a lot of this, whilst not being new, is quite new, it's to reach out to people in academia that there's a lot of help and support. We found that massively. So pick up with Nick and Dennis. They will be able to point you in the right direction. There's also don't feel like you have to do these things for yourselves as well. There are practitioners, and I love sort of Zandra's phrase really, where we talk about the ML that sits within Panintelligence. It's almost like it's the first rung of the ladder. We're not worried about that. We're not shy about that. Often the first step is a really important one. And actually what often it allows people to do is almost to peek over the wall and see what the opportunities actually are. So, that's where, reaching out to partners. We've got partners like Stochastic Solutions up in Edinburgh. They tend to be quite heavily related to academia still at the moment, but that's just the nature of where this industry is right now. So yeah, there's plenty of people out there to help you.
It's an engagement, right? I almost think it's if I think about what Nick has been talking about, what Leader does. When I think about what our members are doing and how they co-engage with, for instance, researchers at the university or at the research institutions and vice versa, by exchanging that knowledge, sometimes you get people from a faculty that haven't worked with AI, started to work as domain experts with an AI company, or the exact opposite, people from AI come to work with a company that hasn't done anything in that with machine learning and is trying to implement that. So I think it's more about trying to be, and there was a nice word, transdisciplinary in that sense. So thinking about, okay, this is how it works here, but only by exchanging and doing more in different environments can you truly understand how things work and where they can find a different place, I guess.
Another thing I'd say, and this is sort of talking directly to some of our customers out there as well, is don't think you've missed the boat. A lot of what you hear out there that is AI or machine learning, I'll do the bunny ears up there, isn't quite all it seems when you lift the covers. So there are a lot of people out there talking a good big game who actually, that they're not a million miles on from where you are right now. So don't go thinking it's this unassailable hill. Get involved, really. You'll learn very quickly.
And I'm conscious of time, and I really wanted to give you all a couple of minutes each before we wrapped up. And I just had I wondered if you could answer a couple of things. So firstly, what have you taken away individually from this conversation? Because I think it's so powerful when you bring people together that perhaps don't usually have these conversations in the pub, but actually kind of helps us to sort of think or create some new perspectives. So I'd really like to hear from each of you. Maybe there's something that you've really taken away from today, and it might be a thought or an action you're going to take or something new. And then if you were to also just think about if there was one thing you think other people should take away from this conversation, imagine they're on the first rung of the ladder. What do you think is the thing that you would like people to consider and take away? So I know those have not asked you to prepare for this, but I just wondered if someone would like to start on what have you taken away and what would you encourage others to take away? I don't mind. Give yourself a minute.
I'll take the home advantage and go first, because I think it helps you guys wrap up really. So I think over the 2 days, funnily enough, that we've had these conversations, there's so much still left to explore and understand. I think we could, apart from the fact that we're probably all a bit tired after 2 hours and have had enough of this particular session, but I think there's so much more to explore and experience from that point of view. I think both of you have challenged me a little bit. I think I tried to be a little controversial because I wanted a little argument in the middle of it. But in terms of the mimicry side of things, I think I've questioned some of what I was thinking along that, and I think it is quite an interesting debate, certainly on the futuristic side of where this could go. I think the other thing I've really got a takeaway is how similar some of the things that we all work on are, and how much there is. So people quite often try to put things in certain pockets or verticals, but actually the challenges that we meet, and we do see this in the day in education, it can be very similar to the challenges in finance, it can be very similar to the challenges in logistics. So actually, like no other discipline, this is an opportunity for all of those different verticals to learn from each other, and that whole open and critical assessment, particularly around the ethics, is something that we should all be much more actively engaged in. I think would be a bit of a takeaway for me personally.
Thanks, Ken. Who'd like to go next?
If I can add on that, I think I agree. I mean, I like provocation in general, so I always like going a bit too far because it can only bring you back to another center. So by challenging, and that's what Nick already said, challenging is so important. So challenging ourselves is as well. I think what I'd like to take away from this is to see how important it is to break through that almost fourth wall in terms of skills training and making sure that people understand what's going on, and that it's if I can understand it, everybody should be able to understand it. So it's about how can we make sure that it's approachable, that we can include everybody, that we can include everybody. And I think what I would like to give people away is just engage. Ask questions, reach out. Just if you have questions about it, just don't hesitate to ask. If I see how much we can solve by just putting together, different sectors or different groups and working like that, you get so many more beautiful insights that you wouldn't have gotten if you're just working in your own silo. And in that sense, I can only, say reach out to work with people you never thought you'd work with. If they're not from your sector or not from your discipline, just go out and ask them questions, and I'm sure they'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Dennis. That's great. And Nick?
Yeah, so I think my key takeaway is, well, I think I've got two. One of them is that I'm pleased that we're so close in agreement on lots of things, which makes me think I'm barking up the right tree with some of this, which is always reassuring. The other thing is that I'm actually quite pleased to have had to think a bit outside of my bubble on some of this stuff. You know, AI and its implementation and application is very broad. So, you know, I had to do some thinking and researching as well as the discussions that we've had, and that's made me think I want to do a bit more of that. So that's good, and I'm probably going to go and do some more reading and thinking. And I suppose the takeaway for people is this is not science. This is not kind of black magic. It's tools that people use to answer questions. So I would say, you know, if you've thought about AI and then thought that it's not for you, then there's some really nice accessible stuff out there that you can read, and I think that you will quite quickly realize that there's quite a lot that you understand and can develop on. And you know, it's that getting in there and starting to understand this stuff is the first step, and I would encourage everyone to do that if they haven't already.
And Nick, because you've obviously got some idea of what those things might be, and we've got people like Claire Garside on the call, part of Digital Access West Yorkshire, who's absolutely about getting you know, digital inclusion in the region, in the city, to those groups that perhaps don't usually have that level of support. Anything you think would be useful for us to share with everybody who's attended today, links to you know, accessible information that we can share, we'd love to do that, and we'll make that a follow-up action, and you know, hopefully give people something if they want to do their own further research and reading, just as you're going to do, Nick. I think let's try and make this flow to everybody and give people those stepping stones to understanding, because ultimately if we can have you know, all the 29 people that joined today's event have taken a little bit away from this and can share that with others, then you know, it's the paddle in the ocean of understanding that we're trying to affect here to get adoption and affect real change with AI. So thank you for everybody who has attended today. It's been 2 hours, which has felt like it's flown by, but also I can appreciate if you're listening and not talking, has maybe been a little bit felt a little bit longer. But thank you for those of you who, you know, you've stayed with us for that time. I really hope you've had something from this that you can take away, share with others. We'll do a follow-up with some links, and you know, just a huge thanks, Nick, Dennis and Ken for your preparation for this event today, your considered answers, and a really, really interesting discussion. We have recorded this, so this will be made available. So, you know, if you want to share that within your own networks, absolutely, please feel free to do so. This is, you know, something that we should use to educate and help in accelerating this conversation together. So thank you very much, everybody. It's now 2 minutes before close. So we'll let everybody who has been on for 2 hours go and have a quick tea break before the next Zoom call, and a comfort break, hopefully. And we'll do the same for you both and for you, Ken. So thank you very much. Really appreciated, and have a fantastic afternoon.
Thanks, Andrew.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.